And I could say in a tough year like this year, we certainly would be in a big world of hurt if we didn't have their support. And so certainly want to just, again, publicly acknowledge the companies that you see, starting with our legacy partners that certainly extend down to our benefactor and leader partners at our strategic alliance partner in the Howard County Economic Development Authority. And so with that, we're going to proceed with hearing some opening remarks from Congressman Sarbanes. And so our agenda for today will, in essence, be you'll have a few minutes coming from the congressman where he'll share some different updates and things that he's working on. And then from there, we'll open it up where you can certainly ask questions via the chat line as well. And so with that, I'm going to just introduce you to Congressman Sarbanes, a little bit about him. Certainly, I would imagine many of you know him, but a little bit about his background. He represents the Maryland's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. Congress since 2007. He currently serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, in addition to the House Subcommittee on Health, the House Subcommittee on Energy, and the House Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. He also serves on the House Oversight and Reform Committee and its Subcommittee on Government Operations. And since 2017, he's chaired the Democracy Reform Task Force, a bold effort in the House to build a government that puts the people's interest ahead of special interest. He's a native of the Baltimore area and has experience working in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Congressman Sarbanes. I'm also going to ask everyone if you would self-mute as well. I'm going to go through on my end and mute you all as well, but certainly would appreciate it if you would do it on your end also. And then from there, when we have questions, we'll open it up the chat line also. So with that, the floor is for, I guess maybe the screen is yours, Congressman Sarbanes.
Well, Leonardo, thanks very much. I definitely appreciate this opportunity to talk with your members, and I want to thank you for being such a resource in Howard County for businesses of all shapes and sizes, particularly right now for smaller businesses that are being really hit hard by the pandemic. And they are the businesses, to be honest, that we're trying to respond to as forcefully as we can with the relief packages that we've been delivering out of Washington over the last 6 to 8 weeks. So I guess what I would start with is there is a tension, as you can imagine, between trying to get significant dollars out the door quickly and the apparatus that's in place to deliver that assistance. And so we've seen some challenges. The Paycheck Protection Program, I'm sure we'll talk more about that when we get into the Q&A. We've now put nearly $600 billion of taxpayer money behind that program. There's been some challenges. It was immediately oversubscribed within the first 10 days. The infrastructure for delivering that assistance was not built, frankly, to handle the scale of loan applications that were coming in. The SBA has never had to handle that amount of traffic before. In fact, they were trying to process in one day what they typically process in a year. So the system was kind of buckling under that pressure, and that created delays and meant that there was a lot of frustration out there. A second thing that happened, and there have been some stories about this, is that larger companies with some inside lending relationships were able to access dollars that really shouldn't have gone to them from this program. A number of them have been browbeaten and forced more recently through some accountability measures that we have in place to return those dollars. But it meant that I think the public was rightly angry that some dollars were being grabbed at the top of the economic food chain by businesses that really couldn't warrant that. And the result was that there was less available for the smaller businesses out there. The third challenge, and I think we've done a good job in responding to this, is that because a lot of the infrastructure for delivering the loans was based on existing relationships, there were people that got there first, and other smaller businesses out there in the community were left with no opportunity. So in the second round of PPP funding, and to remind people on the call, in the first CARES Act, we had about $350 billion that went to the PPP program. In what we call, CARES 3.5, the interim package that we passed about 2 weeks ago, we added an additional $250 billion, but we made sure to reserve $60 billion of that to go out through smaller community lending institutions, community development financial institutions, minority depository institutions, and other similarly situated lenders in the community. The results we're seeing are that smaller businesses are getting access in that second round where they were not getting access previously. I am sure that on this call today, there are people who have been successful in accessing the PPP program and probably others who have not. And I'm interested to hear from your members today, continuing concerns they may have, and frankly, suggestions on how we can improve this going forward. Right now, as you know, and yesterday we introduced the HEROES Act, which is the next big round of stimulus and assistance package that we want to push out to the country in this moment of extreme need. We've made some adjustments there to the PPP program with respect to nonprofits being able to qualify that might not have been eligible before. We can talk more about that if you'd like. And we're otherwise very focused on the situation of workers being separated from their employers. So we want to expand the employee retention tax credit as an incentive for employers to keep employees on. We certainly understand that some of the timelines that apply to the PPP program, where the opportunity would expire on June 30th, or you have to get inside a certain deadline, we're seeking to extend that through the end of the year so that businesses that might otherwise be disqualified would still be eligible. So those are some of the changes that we're looking at. We appreciate that when workers are being separated from their employers, this is putting a burden on them in terms of health insurance benefits, where they then lose that coverage. So what can be done to help extend it, to let people, particularly in Maryland, know that there's an opportunity for open enrollment in the Maryland Health Exchange, that that's an avenue that they can take. But the number one thing is, wherever possible, to try to maintain that connection between an employer and their employees, because frankly, as we begin to reopen the economy, and I'm very interested to hear from you all on that topic, because it's a tricky and challenging one, frankly. Our ability to ramp back up is enhanced if the employer-employee relationship is maintained. The last observation I'll make on the small business front, because again, I know we'll have questions, is that we did provide that some of the small business loans that might not otherwise be available for gig businesses and gig workers rather, and small proprietors, that we expanded eligibility there in terms of access to those programs, including the EIDL loan program under SBA, which is another resource for small businesses, but also in terms of unemployment insurance benefits being available to people in that circumstance. So the effort was to broaden eligibility, expand benefits, obviously direct payments going out to families and individuals across the country were part of that strategy. But I think the general observation when it comes to some of the frustration that people have experienced, whether it's individuals trying to get unemployment insurance or it's small businesses trying to access these loan opportunities, is that the systems that are there to deliver those benefits and those loans are heavily burdened by the amounts they're trying to process right now. And that's created some challenges that I know we're trying to work through on a continuing basis. So broadly speaking, we are going to continue to try to respond to the public health dimensions of this. I very much subscribe to the idea that we have to follow the lead of public health officials and to political leaders who are also following the lead of public health officials. We know we're not going to get our economy back on track if we make the wrong turns when it comes to handling the health dimension of this. And that's where the challenges around reopening exist. At the same time, the economic dislocation from the health crisis has been severe. It's impacted some communities more disproportionately than others. And you may be seeing that in Howard County. The last thing I'll just observe is one of the principal components of the HEROES Act, which we introduced yesterday, was respond to the huge challenge state and local governments are facing in terms of revenue shortfall, because obviously so much activity that generates tax revenue has fallen off or stopped altogether in some instances. So there's huge shortfalls across the country. And the main piece, the sort of anchor component of the HEROES Act is to bring some relief to state and local governments, recognizing the incredibly important role that they play, the ripple effect that their economic strength or weakness has in whatever communities they serve. So that's certainly the case in Howard County. In the first round of the CARES Act, you may know that jurisdictions with less than 500,000 residents did not qualify for direct relief. And that furthermore, that relief, where it did exist, was limited to expenses related to COVID rather than revenue shortfalls that were related to COVID. In this new round, we've expanded those who are eligible, so Howard County would qualify for some significant direct relief from the federal government to try to address the revenue shortfall that they've experienced, and that any restrictions on how the dollars could be used, as long as they're being connected back to the COVID impact, would be removed. So we're trying to be more flexible there and bring relief to the local governments who desperately require that kind of assistance at this point. I'm sure there's many questions you have. I will tell you right now, I won't be able to answer all of them off the top of my head. I'm joined on this call by Teresa Shalhoub, who's on my staff. She may have some answers at her fingertips if I do not, but we will definitely follow up. And Leonardo, thank you for the opportunity to participate today. My final initial comment here will be thank you to those of you on the call who are doing everything you can to keep your businesses intact, but also to follow the basic precautions and public health guidance that we are observing these days. And I do think Maryland's done a pretty good job, and I want to salute the governor and our county executives across the state, including Calvin Ball in Howard County, for the leadership role that they're playing. It's important to have consistent, uniform, and reasoned guidance projected out to the public. That's how you earn trust, and it's how you get people to take the measures that will allow us to get to the other side of this public health crisis. With that, let me turn it back to you, and we'll go to whatever Q&A we want to do. I think somebody might be mute, because I'm not hearing. Leonardo, I'm not hearing your.
Hi, can you hear me?
I hear you, yes, but I don't hear Leonardo.
Okay.
He may be muted.
Okay, I should be good now. I'm sorry. I made sure I was on with my telephone so that I would be clear
Gotcha.
from an audio perspective.
Okay.
But so the first question is ultimately there was an announcement yesterday, of course, that from the House that there was potentially a $3 trillion bill that was introduced that would include $1,200 direct payments to Americans, extend unemployment benefits and mortgage relief, and so forth. But yet, the comment that came from the Republican side was that they were focused more on perhaps legislation that might shield businesses from virus-related lawsuits, et cetera. How would you say we find a balance in terms of certainly addressing what might be business concerns on one side, but unemployment benefits and certainly dealing with the general public on the other side? How do we find that balance in what appears to be another stimulus package forthcoming?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, I would say that what we introduced yesterday, I think very much is on the side of businesses as well as on the side of individuals and families. If you look at the provisions, if you look at our efforts to continue to keep the PPP program strong and make sure that the Small Business Administration has the resources it needs to respond to people's concerns, that's certainly very much a part of the HEROES Act. Other measures like the employee retention tax credit, which are designed to help businesses who want to maintain that connection with their employees, lifting up the opportunity for assistance for COBRA coverage, which can bring obviously some assurance to employees with respect to health benefits. So I think there's a lot in there that recognizes the challenges that businesses, particularly small businesses, are facing. And that's been a theme right from the beginning. And I think it's one of the reasons that all the bills until this point have essentially earned broad bipartisan Republican and Democratic support. Now, we'll see how this next round of negotiations goes. Yes, the initial reaction from Leader McConnell in the Senate and some of the Republicans in both the House and the Senate is to position themselves against the broad outlines of this bill. We'll see ultimately where the back and forth lands. I do think that the public is very much in support of the key components that we've put in here, and that includes small business owners understanding the importance of that. We certainly know that mayors across the country on a bipartisan basis, governors led by Governor Hogan and Governor Cuomo out of New York, who are the co-chairs of the National Governors Association, they are advocating very strongly for the relief that will come to state and local governments and other efforts like the stabilization fund with respect to education and so forth. The issue of liability protection for businesses, That's a tricky one. I think you have to be careful there in terms of overreaching for that. And I think there will be discussion as to where that lands. As many of you know, the workers' comp system is largely designed to address that basket of concerns on the part of businesses. And I think there may be opportunities to put some additional supports and assistance and funding behind the worker compensation contributions that need to be made in recognition of the pressures that businesses are feeling. So we are anticipating passing the HEROES Act in the House by the end of the week. Then obviously there will be a back and forth dynamic with the Senate, and we will land somewhere, hopefully, in a bipartisan fashion. And the result may look somewhat different from what we are initially putting out there on the floor this Friday. But what our leadership has reminded us of is that every element of this bill is consistent with categories of assistance that have already been included in the previous bipartisan pieces of legislation. So this is not an attempt to overreach into new areas of concern. It's not an attempt to go build a new worldview in the midst of a pandemic. It is very much continuing to try to respond to the huge pressures that this COVID outbreak is placing on families, on individuals, on small businesses, on communities all across the country, and certainly on our frontline workers, healthcare workers, delivery people, first responders, et cetera. Can't hear you again.
Sorry. This next question, I'm going to actually ask, there are two questions actually, but since they're related, I'm going to ask them together. And so you referenced the HEROES legislation. And so this question, and you may know specifically what it means, but it says if you would please discuss the 3610 changes. I don't know if that's 3,610 or if there's a piece in there that's called the 3610, but I'm just reading it as it was presented. But it says, please discuss 3610 changes in HEROES Act. So that's the first question. And then the second question ultimately goes to the unemployment stimulus of the $600 per week. What this individual is saying is that ultimately they certainly understand the why, but that it's also hindering employees, it's hindering employers from getting employees to come back to work. And so the question is, will that be extended? That's set to end on July 31st, or with this potential next stimulus package extended?
So let me start with the unemployment insurance benefit question. Maybe in the meantime, Teresa can send me a text and remind me what 3610 is. I have a lot of different section numbers of the bill in my head. That's a reference back to the section number in the original CARES Act, and we are making some. In terms of the unemployment insurance, we are aware that the $600 additional weekly benefit with respect to unemployment insurance, in different places, depending on the business, depending on the community, the geography, the nature of the job, can have some consequence in terms of people being hired back or wanting to come back. So I think we're keeping an eye on that. My understanding is that we want to continue to have an extra benefit on top of the normal amount of benefits that would qualify. I think that is included in the HEROES Act that we have introduced. I do anticipate that that's going to get robust discussion and debate in the sort of conversation that goes on not just within our own chamber in the House, but also as we have conversations with the Senate about ultimately where these benefits should land. So there's two components that you've alluded to. One is extending the time period that allows people to continue qualifying for unemployment benefits. And as you know, the normal 26 weeks was extended by 13 weeks. There's certainly interest in extending those further. And then the discussion around what expanded benefits looks like, what those amounts are going to be, and for what period of time they would also be included in any extended opportunity for those insurance benefits. I think that's going to get some attention and discussion. So it is helpful to me to have that input from businesses of varying sizes, but certainly small businesses are probably more focused on that dynamic and some of the challenges it can produce than some of the larger businesses. So I invite you to collect, again, any other comments or perspective on that you have as we move forward, and forward those along to me, because that'll help as we have this conversation in the next, in the coming days. So it's a very good question. Teresa, I don't know if you,
Excellent.
if you can remind me of the 3610 section. I'll try to come back to that later in the call. I have a feeling it's the PPP
Congressman,
program.
I think the 3610 allows agencies to reimburse contractors to keep their employees.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll try to get a little more information about that and get that back to you and to your members, Leonardo.
Okay. Yeah, and it says here, I had a chance to actually read it from an email now, and it does say it is a federal contracting provision. And
Right.
and so certainly I think if you need to research that, that's fine.
Obviously,
another question that just
obviously,
came in.
in Howard County, in our state, federal contractors are a key part of the business infrastructure. So provisions like that are highly relevant. So appreciate that.
You're welcome. Let's see, the next question says, is it accurate reporting that the CDC is supposed to share guidelines on how we can safely open, but it is being shelved?
Yeah, that's been frustrating, to be honest, from day one, is that the guidance that we would hope to get on a consistent basis from the federal government, from the White House Coronavirus Task Force and so forth, has not been offered up consistently. And in fact, there have been some instances where the CDC and the task force released guidance, then pulled it back. So it's been very uneven, and that's not helpful, obviously, to the public in terms of taking its cues on what best practices should be. And that's meant, in fact, that a lot of times governors and other local leaders have had to step into the vacuum that creates. We continue to push very hard for a national strategy on a number of things. One certainly is with respect to standards of what it looks to reopen the country and how we both do that, but at the same time observe the health precautions that can keep us safe and keep workers who are coming back into those spaces safe and keep consumers and others safe. So we continue to ask for that guidance from CDC and from the White House. I do think it will be forthcoming because there's a lot of pressure for that to happen. What I don't know yet, and I'm hoping will be there, is whether, how useful will it be? Will it be watered down? Will there be so many exceptions to it that it really doesn't offer a lot of guidance to people out there or to governors and mayors in terms of designing their own response. So we're going to have to see what that looks like. I can tell you that when it comes to personal protective equipment, when it comes to testing, when it comes to nursing home strategies, we are insisting in the HEROES Act that there be a national strategy for those things, that the various agencies that have jurisdiction on that collaborate in a more focused way than they have before, and that those plans be put in writing and they be delivered not just to Congress, but broadly to the public. We know that without the kind of broad testing, contact tracing, isolation, social distancing strategies, and so forth in place, we're never going to get ahead of this thing, because that's what gives us eyes on the infection and on the spread of this virus. And this virus is very pernicious and it's very resourceful. And if we can't see clearly what's happening, we can't make plans for all the other things we need to do to kind of get back to some sense of normalcy or a new normal. So the emphasis on that and the public health guidance that needs to come with it is very strong right now. We're going to continue to push hard on the White House and on CDC and the other relevant agencies to deliver that broad guidance and to do it sooner rather than later. But it has been a challenge, to be honest.
Okay. So this next question, well, the next two questions, in fact, dive into the PPP loan process. And so this first one says the IRS put out a ruling that any expenses forgiven by PPP would not be tax deductible. And this may result in an unintended consequence. For example, if a company has $100,000 in payroll forgiven, that is at a break even, would result in a 21% federal tax and approximately 9% state tax. So for spending the $100,000, a small business would end up with a $30,000 tax bill. And so the question ultimately is this being addressed in any way?
Yes, it is. Because that was actually not in the CARES bill that we passed per se. It was an IRS ruling or interpretation that they put onto the program as it was being designed and pushed out the door. So I'm fairly confident, based on the calls I've been on the last couple days, that the HEROES Act addresses that so that you would get the deduction and there wouldn't be the negative impact that you're talking about here. This is an example, I'll just be very honest, of how when you're moving very fast to get dollars out the door because you have an emergency on your hands, these kinds of provisions and interpretations can get tacked on in ways that create negative consequences and obviously move in a different direction than the kind of relief you're trying to bring. So I do believe that is addressed in the HEROES Act, and that should provide some assurances to businesses out there that we're rightly concerned about that.
Yeah. And this next question also is related to the PPP. And so it says that the PPP does not address the monetary issues challenging this particular person's small business. So they said they also applied for an EIDL loan on March 30th. And is there any resource for obtaining a status or pushing the application forward? That SBA representatives are not able to provide any status by phone, and they get a different story each time they call, and ultimately that there's not a system for looking up the idle applications.
Well, everything you just raised, I can believe, because I know there've been real glitches there. The SBA is underwater in terms of trying to handle not just the traditional EIDL loans, the economic injury disaster loans, but then standing up this whole new PPP program on top of that. So they're under a lot of pressure right now. That's not an excuse for anybody who's out there trying to get this relief and these loans. It is an explanation in part of why there are delays and why, frankly, the customer assistance component of that agency is overwhelmed right now and not really meeting the needs of the moment. If you have specific situations where you're trying to get through to understand the status of a loan, let us know about that. That's not to say we aren't having our own problems. My office, in terms of getting responses from some of these agencies, whether it's SBA or it's the Maryland Department of Labor with respect to unemployment insurance benefits. But we will help you if we can. And sometimes we're able to spot some common themes that allow us to make the case for a more systemic change in the way they're operating. So that can be helpful to us as we basket up concerns that we're getting from other businesses around my district and around the state. So I certainly understand that frustration. Please put that person in touch with my office, and we'll see if we can be of any assistance.
Okay. And so we're going to kind of stay on this PPP and loan topic. And so this next question pertains just originally to the PPP rollout and so forth. And really, it's just kind of just your opinion. And that is, many would have characterized the rollout of the PPP loan process as chaotic. What would you say has been learned by you and your colleagues in Congress? And what would you say the SBA perhaps has learned through your conversations with them? And that with the end result being, as we look to future, whether that's whether we extend the PPP loans, whether it's funds are appropriated again, but ultimately, what have you been able to glean from these first couple of rollouts that ultimately continue to enhance future, perhaps, loan programs from a PPP perspective?
Right. Well, I agree it was chaotic. There's no question about that. As I say, the demand was huge. The pipeline, people have trouble getting into the pipeline. It got oversubscribed very quickly. You had certain businesses that just didn't have lending relationships that allowed them. I mean, for any contractors on the call, small federal contractors, you understand it's a similar theme to the frustration you often have of trying to access some of the large defense contracts and other contracts that are let by the federal government in Maryland and in this area, which is that the larger actors have pre-existing relationships. They know who to call. They get a tip-off early in the process. And so the smaller contractors are left begging for that work, which is why we are constantly trying to create more access and preference for small businesses, and minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned, women-owned businesses, and so forth. We're seeing a little bit of that in this situation where when it comes to these loans going out through the new program, people who have an inside track get access to them faster. So there's no question that we saw some of that happening, and people are right to be angry about it. It's going to be, I think, a real focus of this special oversight committee that was established in the House and is led by Majority Whip Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. In terms of what this means going forward, I just don't know that the SBA, being the agency that it is necessarily the place where you're gonna, as you look to the future, create the infrastructure to deliver this kind of assistance to businesses in in emergency situations. One idea that's being talked about, it's going to take more thinking than we have in the current moment. We can't deploy it right away, but you have heard some discussions of something called a paycheck guarantee program. This is modeled on what we see in some other countries around the world, where essentially the government will step in under certain conditions, and those are strictly designed, and effectively pick up the payroll expense of companies that are facing certain challenges that are the result of kind of these act of God situations. That there's maybe a better and easier and more efficient way to deliver support and assistance if you do it that way than trying to do it through a forgivable loan design like we have now with the PPP program. So PPP has its merits. Under the circumstances, it was the fastest way to get this out the door, at least in theory. But whether that's the best design and infrastructure going forward, I think is going to get a lot of conversation as we move past this. And whether it's public health infrastructure, where we've seen that there's huge gaps across the country with disproportionate impact on certain communities and zip codes, or whether it's the economic dislocation that the health crisis has visited upon so many communities and small businesses across the country. The challenge is to raise our baseline. Let's move the baseline up of what public health looks like in this country. Let's move the baseline up of what economic supports should be in place for small businesses, for example, so that when you have these crises, you're starting from a higher place and you don't have as much ground to cover in a very short time frame. So I think a lot of lessons learned as we move along with this. And frankly, small businesses are going to be the ones that can get us smart on this. Because you're the ones that are being impacted most severely under these conditions. And you're the ones that have the least reserves, assets, economic buffer to weather a storm like this. So if we don't design good ways of sort of anchoring you in the midst of it, we know we're going to lose a lot of small businesses. We also know that's the engine that drives our economy. So it's a very good question. I think local chambers like yours have a real role to play in advising us on what we can do moving forward with that and making sure we're doing the right thing.
Okay. And so on that same note, this next question is related to, I think it was on Friday, there was legislation introduced by Congresswoman Anna Ingshu and Kathy McMorris. It was called the Caring for Startup Employees Act. And so in this case, this would be a bill that would grant more economic assistance to startup companies through the PPP. And so the question here is, should this bill, pass? Obviously, that's going to dramatically increase the number of companies eligible for PPP loans. And so is there perhaps a concern that SBA would, again, run out of money, particularly if you've now got another large wave of businesses that are eligible? Or, for instance, would that also mean that there are plans to obviously appropriate more funding for SBA to be able to support, the PPP now that you may be bringing in startup companies? I know there's also, I think, legislation that would make eligible all 501Cs as opposed to just C3s. And certainly that's something that we've been following closely from a chamber perspective. But particularly, I guess if you could maybe share a little bit about the Caring for Startup Employees legislation, because there may be some on the call that aren't familiar with that. And you certainly know there are a number of startup firms throughout Maryland and the country as well.
Yeah, so I'm aware of that bill and that issue. I'm not aware, and we can find the answer to this, whether that got folded into the HEROES Act that we introduced yesterday. I'm doubtful that it did, but we can look at that, and it's an example of, I mean, people come up with legitimate ideas about how to help certain groups that weren't eligible in the first round. The tension, and I've talked about this, is you don't want to get too far afield from the kind of immediate, meaningful response that gets to the lion's share of people who need it, particularly when there's a finite amount of money. So I think we do have to be careful about who we keep adding into the eligibility category as far as that goes. So I can get the answer to the question of whether Anna Eshoo and Kathy McMorris Rogers' proposal with respect to startups was included. If I had to bet, I would say probably not, but it's a large bill, so don't quote me on that. We'll get the answer. I do think that we've seen a slowing of the applications coming in from small businesses with respect to the second round. So while the first round was immediately almost oversubscribed and the $350 billion was gone, with respect to the second tranche, the about $250 billion, I think there's still about $100 billion in that fund to support the PPP program. So, for example, that means that at present, there's not in the HEROES Act a significant additional appropriation for PPP. Obviously, we are going to want to keep an eye on that. We're very happy that more of the loans are finding their way to the smallest businesses out there. And I'm sure if there's a business on the phone that heard me just say that the applications have slowed and there's still money available, and yet they're having trouble getting their application process, will continue to be frustrated by the situation. But we're definitely seeing a different picture after the second round that we offered than with respect to what happened with the immediate demand on the first round. That's just to say that it's unfortunately not a science, it's more of an art trying to predict what the demand will be and what the dollar figures are that you need to have available for people to make sure that opportunity is there. And that relates a little bit back to your question about the startups and what kind of dollars they might pull down if they were also eligible. With respect to the C3 expansion, so I believe what the HEROES Act does, who knows where this will ultimately land after negotiation. We did do something I thought was very important, which was expand the eligibility of C3s to larger nonprofits. So you may remember there was a 500-person cap on nonprofits that could participate in the PPP program. That cap's been lifted. So larger nonprofits, particularly aggregate organizations like a YMCA, for example, that has a lot of smaller locations, but you put it all together and it has, it could have thousands of employees. So they will be eligible. At the same time, I believe that the restriction to C3s has now been broadened so that any 501c organizations, which would include C5s and C6s, i.e. include local chambers of commerce, would also qualify. Now, whether there are special guidelines that go with that are going to, narrow the organizations that are eligible remains to be seen in sort of the fine print of this bill. But I think initially that's what the HEROES Act would do, would broaden out eligibility. So we'll see where those discussions land.
Yeah, and certainly I would say from a Howard County perspective, we're definitely interested in seeing what happens on that end from the expansion of the 501Cs, as you and I've talked. And I think not only from the chamber, but even from, for instance, like Howard County Tourism, or even as I think about other associations within the greater Central Maryland area. So we're definitely keeping our fingers crossed there. But in looking at the time here, and we're getting extremely close to 2 o'clock, and I know that you have another engagement as well. And so with that, as we prepare to wrap up, just really want to give you maybe a couple of minutes to kind of just close, and anything you'd like to share, or kind of I guess parting shots, if you will, that you'd just like to share with the group.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Leonardo, for the invitation, and thanks to all who participated today. I'm sure we didn't get to everybody's questions, and I'm sure my answers to every question weren't necessarily satisfying for everyone on the call. But know this, that we want to make sure we're staying in very close contact with you. Any issues that your members are facing, please let us know about that. Any questions we can try to chase down the answers on, like the 3610 thing, which we'll definitely get back to you on. Please bring those to us. I've been in this long enough to now not be afraid to say that I will not have the answer to every question you ask me, but I will do my best to try to get the answer. And we've got a great staff and a great team in my office that are working overtime right now to respond to all kind of constituent inquiries, including those that are coming from small businesses that are facing some of these frustrations that we talked about. I do think that the input we're getting from chambers, from small businesses, is not only critical right now in this moment, but will be critical on the other side of this crisis and this economic disruption, in terms of being smarter, as we discussed a moment ago, about how support and relief can flow to small businesses. I also think that you all are going to be the ones to give us feedback on what this reopening of our economy looks like. We know that even as some governors are beginning to put in place a phased reopening, moving to curbside pickup, opening certain establishments subject to social distancing and other precautions, that there is a dynamic here. Just because a business opens doesn't mean the public's going to come in the door or pull up curbside. We have to get the public to a place where there's a confidence level that if they venture out and they start to access the reopening economy, that they can do that safely. And this is where the intersection between good, strong, consistent, and science-based public health guidance on the one hand, and what it means to restart the economy on the other hand, is critical. And it's going to be a challenge for all of us to figure out what that balance looks like. But in many respects, small businesses are the ones that are right at that intersection. You are sort of balanced on top of that conversation in a way that others are not. And so, Leonardo, I'm going to be particularly interested in checking in with you periodically as this reopening begins to be phased in, to get your input on what that looks like, where we need to be careful, what the challenges are that are being faced by businesses of all sizes, but certainly by the small businesses that are operating in Howard County. So thank you again for the opportunity. I appreciate it very much, and look forward to doing this again soon.
Likewise, and thank you, and certainly just be happy to continue having this dialogue and sharing insights both from the chamber, but also and our partner in economic development, Larry Twill, certainly sends his regrets. He had an executive committee meeting that ran much longer than he originally anticipated. And so, but I think between the two of us, we can certainly provide a lot of that feedback in the days ahead. Also, you know, we're having a series of virtual meetings that we're calling Preparing to Open. And the whole idea is to start having conversations around everything from employer liability to behavioral and mental health, to also facilities management, education, childcare, and so forth. So I think we're going to glean a lot from those over the next 2 to 3 weeks as we have those events as well, and certainly we'll share any insights that we have with you. And so for those of you still remaining with us, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you found this information very beneficial, just the overall knowledge. For those that you were able to get your questions answered, hopefully, again, this has worked out for you. And for those that we didn't get to, certainly we apologize. You know, time restraints certainly prohibit some time for getting to all of the questions, but want to encourage everyone to continue to visit the Chamber's website, read your emails as well. The Congressman sends out a newsletter that's probably going out almost every other day now with various updates and town halls and vital information as well. So again, thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Congressman
Leonardo,
Sarbanes.
let me just say, by all means, any question we didn't get to, send those to us and we'll try to get back with some answers. Thank you all.
Excellent. Take care. Bye-bye.